I woke up to someone hammering on my front door like they were trying to serve a warrant, and for a second, still half asleep, I honestly thought maybe somebody had crashed a car into the mailbox again. We'd had rain for 6 straight days in Oak Ridge Hills, the kind of cold Tennessee rain that doesn't fall so much as hover in the air like a threat. Everything smelled wet, the gutters sounded like rivers, and every backyard looked one storm away from becoming a swamp. So I dragged myself downstairs in sweatpants, opened the door, and there stood my neighbor, Dean Mercer, soaked head to toe, holding his phone out in front of him like a cop flashing a badge. His face was bright red, rain dripping off his beard, breathing hard like he'd rehearsed this whole confrontation in the shower before coming over. "You flooded my basement," he snapped immediately. Not even a hello, not even good morning. Just straight to the accusation. I blinked at him, still trying to reboot my brain. "What?" He shoved the phone closer to my face. There were pictures of muddy water against concrete walls, boxes floating around, some ruined carpet, dramatic stuff. "Your damn driveway did this," he barked, pointing toward the edge of my property. "Ever since you resurfaced it last year, the water drained straight toward my house." And listen, when somebody comes at you that aggressively before sunrise, your brain doesn't even know where to start. You're standing there trying to process coffee-less reality while another grown man is already halfway through his courtroom speech. I looked over at the driveway, same driveway I'd had for years, same slope, same drainage angle approved by the county inspector when we repaved it. Nothing about it changed except the top layer of asphalt. But Dean wasn't interested in reality. "You're paying for the damages," he continued, stabbing a finger toward me hard enough I thought he might poke a hole through my chest. $3,200. Or I file a lawsuit. Now normally, when somebody says lawsuit in a suburban neighborhood, it's mostly theater. HOA neighborhoods are basically adult daycare centers with landscaping rules. People threaten legal action over mailbox colors and trash cans left out too long. So honestly, I almost laughed. Which, looking back, probably made him even angrier. Because Dean had that personality. The kind of guy who treated every disagreement like a personal attack against his authority. He'd moved into the neighborhood about 2 years earlier after tearing down an old brick bungalow and building one of those oversized gray modern farmhouses that looks like it belongs in a dental office commercial. 3-car garage, black trim, security cameras everywhere. The kind of house built by someone who desperately wants strangers to think they're winning at life. And from day one, Dean acted like he ran the street. Complained about people parking in front of his property. Complained about basketball noise. Complained about Halloween decorations being tacky. One time he reported my friend's pickup truck to the HOA because it had excessive mud on the tires. I wish I were kidding. So standing there in the rain, listening to him blame my driveway for his flooded basement, I could already feel where this was going. Not because he actually believed I caused it, but because Dean needed somebody to blame. That's the thing about people like him. Accountability feels physically painful to them. If something breaks, somebody else did it. If something fails, somebody sabotaged them. Their ego literally cannot process personal responsibility. And deep down, I think Dean hated the fact that my house sat slightly uphill from his. Sounds stupid, I know, but suburban ego is weird. He saw water flowing downhill and immediately decided I must have engineered some kind of anti-Dean drainage conspiracy. Meanwhile, as he's yelling at me, actual rainwater is visibly running down the curb toward the storm drain, away from his property entirely. You could literally see it happening. But anger doesn't care about physics. "I've already talked to my contractor," he said, pacing around now like a prosecutor in a crime documentary. "He said your driveway violates runoff codes." That caught my attention because I knew for a fact it didn't. We'd pulled permits, hired licensed people, passed inspections. The whole thing was documented down to the inch. But Dean said it with such confidence that for half a second, even I started wondering if maybe something weird had happened underneath the pavement. That's another thing aggressive people do. They overwhelm you with certainty so fast that you start doubting your own memory. This is a psychological trap, by the way, and manipulative people rely on it constantly. They come in loud, emotional, aggressive, because if they can destabilize you early, they control the conversation. Dean finally stopped pacing and pointed at me one last time. "You'll hear from my attorney," he muttered, before stomping back across the soaked grass toward his house. And I just stood there in the doorway, rain blowing sideways into the kitchen, wondering how the hell my Tuesday morning had somehow turned into an episode of courtroom television. Then, 3 days later, I got served papers for property damage and negligence. And that's when I realized Dean wasn't bluffing. He actually thought he could pin the entire disaster on me. Now, before I get into what happened in court, let me explain something, because this kind of situation is way more common than people realize, especially in HOA neighborhoods where everybody's constantly staring over fences trying to figure out whose property is ruining whose peace of mind. According to standard procedure, drainage disputes usually come down to one simple question. Did somebody intentionally or negligently alter the natural flow of water? That's it. Not feelings, not assumptions, not, my contractor said so during a barbecue. Actual evidence, permits, engineering, inspections. And from a legal perspective, courts care way less about who's yelling louder and way more about documentation. That's where people like Dean make a huge mistake. They think confidence equals credibility. It doesn't. If anything, judges tend to get suspicious when somebody walks into a dispute already acting like the verdict belongs to them. And psychologically, what Dean was doing made perfect sense once I stepped back and looked at it. His basement flooding wasn't just expensive, it was embarrassing. He built this giant showpiece house to impress everybody on the block, and now it smelled like mildew and wet drywall. So instead of accepting that maybe his own maintenance failed, his brain looked for an external villain. This is a psychological trap a lot of homeowners fall into because blame feels emotionally cheaper than responsibility. The lesson here is, whenever property disputes turn emotional, the person staying calm usually has the advantage. Not because calm people are automatically right, but because panic makes people sloppy. And trust me, Dean was about to get very sloppy. The first court hearing happened on a Thursday morning, gray skies outside. Everybody in the room looking tired except Dean, who walked in like he was about to deliver the closing argument in the trial of the century. Guy actually wore a navy suit with a pocket square for small claims court. That alone should have warned me we were dealing with a dangerous level of suburban ego. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there beside my attorney, Carla Jennings, holding a folder full of permits and contractor invoices, trying not to laugh at how absurd my life had become. Dean didn't just come prepared, he came theatrical. He had enlarged color photographs, printed timelines, screenshots of weather reports. I swear if the hearing had lasted another 10 minutes, he probably would have rolled in a projector screen. The judge, an older man named Judge Halpern, looked exhausted before the hearing even started, like he'd already spent the morning listening to arguments about fence heights and barking dogs. Then Dean stood up and launched into his performance. "Your Honor," he began dramatically, "my family has suffered substantial property damage due to my neighbor's irresponsible construction modifications." Construction modifications. He said it like I'd built a hydroelectric dam overnight. He started waving around photos of muddy puddles near our property line, zoomed in shots of water stains in his basement, pictures of soaked cardboard boxes stacked against concrete walls. The elevation change to his driveway redirected storm runoff directly into my foundation. He continued, pacing slightly while he talked. We never had flooding issues before he altered the grading. And here's the thing. If you didn't know the actual facts, he sounded convincing. That's what scared me a little. Confident liars are dangerous because they build momentum emotionally before evidence ever enters the room. Dean kept talking about reckless negligence and property interference, like he'd memorized phrases from legal dramas. At one point he even said, "I have reason to believe the runoff pressure compromised structural drainage integrity," which sounded suspiciously like something copied from Google at 2 in the morning. Carla sat beside me completely expressionless, occasionally jotting notes down, which honestly made me more nervous because I couldn't tell whether she was impressed or preparing to bury him. Then Dean finally finished and sat down with this smug little exhale, like he'd just secured victory for civilization itself. Judge Halpern adjusted his glasses and turned toward Carla. Response. And this is where everything shifted. Carla stood up slowly, calm as a surgeon. No theatrics. No dramatic voice. She walked to the table, picked up one of Dean's own basement photographs, and held it up. "Mr. Mercer," she said casually, "you testified that surface runoff entered your basement from the exterior foundation wall, correct?" Dean nodded immediately. "Correct. And you believe my client's driveway redirected rainwater toward your property?" "Yes." Carla tilted the photograph slightly. Then can you explain why the water lines visible in this image begin below grade level instead of above it? Silence. Immediate silence. Dean blinked hard. What? Carla walked closer. The staining pattern starts from beneath the slab line, not from exterior seepage over the wall. If rainwater entered from uphill runoff, the saturation marks would originate higher on the foundation. Dean opened his mouth, then closed it again. Judge Halpern leaned forward slightly for the first time all morning. And I swear to God you could actually feel the atmosphere in the room change. That one question cracked the whole performance right down the middle. Carla continued calmly. Additionally, if water pressure was entering laterally from the property boundary, we would expect erosion patterns along the exterior grade near my client's driveway. None appear in the submitted evidence. Dean started talking fast after that, which is always a bad sign. Well, the flooding happened during the storm. Obviously the pressure. Carla interrupted gently. Did you have the sump discharge system inspected prior to filing this claim? Another pause. No foundation drainage? No French drain maintenance? No. Judge Halpern looked increasingly unimpressed. Carla finally requested a continuance so a licensed civil engineer could inspect both properties before the court proceeded further. Dean agreed immediately, probably because he still thought reality was somehow on his side. Big mistake. Huge. A week later the engineer's report came back, and honestly, reading it was one of the most satisfying experiences of my adult life. It completely destroyed Dean's entire argument. According to the inspection, my driveway drained exactly as designed, toward the municipal street channel, fully compliant with county runoff requirements. No redirection. No unlawful grading. No excessive runoff concentration. In fact, the report specifically stated that my resurfacing project had not materially altered the existing drainage slope at all. But then came the fun part. The actual flooding source. Dean's own drainage system had basically been rotting underground for years. His sump pump discharge line had partially collapsed, allowing water to collect near the foundation instead of dispersing away from the structure. On top of that, the perimeter foundation drain was clogged with sediment buildup and root intrusion. Translation? His basement wasn't flooding because of my driveway. It was flooding because he ignored maintenance until his expensive showpiece house started drowning itself from underneath. Carla called me after reviewing the report and literally laughed into the phone. Oh, he's cooked, she said. And apparently, she wasn't done digging yet. Because once she smelled weakness, she started pulling municipal records tied to Dean's property permits and inspection history. That's when the entire thing went from embarrassing to catastrophic. Turns out, 2 years earlier, right after construction on Dean's custom house finished, county inspectors had already cited the property for improper drainage discharge near the rear foundation wall. Twice. 2 separate citations. Both warning that unresolved drainage failures could result in basement flooding during extended rainfall events. And the best part? Dean had personally signed the compliance acknowledgments, meaning he absolutely knew about the issue long before he ever blamed me. That changed everything. Because now this wasn't just a mistaken accusation. Now it looked like Dean knowingly ignored documented infrastructure problems, then tried to shift financial responsibility onto a neighbor when the predictable consequences finally showed up. From a legal perspective, judges hate that. Deeply hate it. Especially when public records prove prior knowledge. The second hearing felt completely different from the first one. Dean walked in quieter this time, still trying to maintain confidence, but you could see tension all over him. His suit looked wrinkled now. He avoided eye contact. Carla, meanwhile, walked in carrying a thick binder that may as well have been a funeral program for his case. Judge Halpern reviewed the engineering report first, flipping through pages silently while Dean shifted in his seat. Then Carla presented the county citations. Your Honor, she said evenly. These records demonstrate the plaintiff had prior documented notice of drainage system defects associated with his own foundation infrastructure. She slid the signed acknowledgement forms across the table, including acknowledgement of flood risk. Judge Halpern read quietly for maybe 15 seconds, then raised one eyebrow, so slowly it looked cinematic. Mr. Mercer, he said finally, is this your signature? Dean looked trapped. Yes, and these notices were issued before the flooding incident? Well, technically, answered directly. Yes. Man, the silence after that was brutal. because everybody in the room knew the case was dead already. Dean still tried one last desperate pivot. The driveway could have worsened the situation. Judge Halpern cut him off immediately. The engineering report contradicts that assertion. Another silence. Then came the line I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Judge Halpern closed the file, looked directly at Dean, and said, "Neglected maintenance does not transfer liability to adjacent homeowners." Boom. Case dismissed. Just like that. Clean. Sharp. Final. But it got even better. Because Carla requested reimbursement for legal expenses and engineering inspection costs due to the frivolous nature of the claim after documented prior notice. Judge Halpern approved it on the spot. Dean's face physically changed color. I'm not exaggerating. The man looked like somebody unplugged him from a power source. You are ordered to compensate the defendant for reasonable legal and inspection expenses, the judge said while signing paperwork. Dean just sat there stunned, jaw hanging slightly open like his brain couldn't process what had happened. And honestly, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. But then I remembered him screaming at me in the rain, threatening lawsuits before ever checking his own damn drainage system. That sympathy disappeared real fast. When the gavel finally came down, Carla leaned over and whispered, "That's why documentation matters." And she was right. Because in the end, the storm didn't destroy Dean's basement. His ego did. He spent so much energy trying to protect his pride that he ignored the actual problem sitting underneath his own house the entire time. Meanwhile, all I had done was keep records, stay calm, and let reality do the heavy lifting. And as we walked out of the courthouse, Dean wouldn't even look at me, which honestly worked out great because I didn't have anything left to say to him anyway. You know what's funny? After all of that, after the lawsuit, the inspections, the hearings, the dramatic accusations in the rain like we were starring in some low-budget legal thriller, the neighborhood eventually went completely back to normal. Kids rode bikes again. People mowed their lawns. Amazon packages kept disappearing off porches in broad daylight. Suburban America healed itself like it always does. But Dean changed. You could feel it. Before all this, he walked around the neighborhood like a guy campaigning for mayor of the HOA. After court, head down. Quiet. Suddenly very interested in minding his own business. And honestly, I think the humiliation hit him harder than the legal fees ever did. Because money comes back. Ego damage sticks around. The lesson here is, a lot of homeowner disputes are never really about property. They're about identity, pride, control. People tie their self-worth to their houses so tightly that any problem with the property starts feeling like a personal attack. Then fear kicks in, and fear makes people reckless. According to standard procedure, most drainage conflicts could be resolved with inspections and documentation before lawyers ever get involved. But emotionally charged homeowners skip that part because they want validation first and facts second. That's where everything spirals. And look, from a legal perspective, the biggest thing I learned is painfully simple. Keep records for everything. Every permit, every invoice, every inspection. Save emails, save photos, save dates. Because the truth means absolutely nothing if you can't prove it when somebody decides to weaponize a courtroom against you. And psychologically, calm people usually win long games. Not because life is magically fair, but because panic makes people expose themselves eventually. Dean probably could have avoided the entire disaster if he'd just admitted the drainage problem early and fixed it. Instead, he built this whole fantasy where I was the villain because blaming me felt easier than facing his own negligence. This is a psychological trap people fall into constantly. If accountability threatens their ego, they'll invent enemies instead of solutions. The crazy part is, I never even hated the guy. I just wanted him to stop trying to make his problems my responsibility. That's it. And maybe that's the real takeaway from all this. Good neighbors solve problems together. Bad neighbors look for scapegoats. So now I'm curious, if somebody accused you of damaging their property and threatened legal action immediately, would you stay calm, or would you lose your mind too? Because after this whole experience, I honestly understand why HOA arguments turn ordinary adults into absolute maniacs sometimes. One flooded basement, and suddenly everybody thinks they're in a Netflix courtroom documentary.